For 30 years, they called him a liar. The old man who claimed he'd been behind enemy lines in places that didn't officially exist. His own family stopped believing him, until a declassified Pentagon document surfaced with his name on it, and coordinates that matched every impossible story he'd ever told. The October morning fog pressed against the grimy windows of Sunset Horizon's nursing home like ghostly fingers searching for entry, filtering weak sunlight into pale, ethereal beams that barely illuminated the institutional beige common room where hope seemed to come to die slowly and quietly. The building itself bore the unmistakable marks of budget constraints and administrative neglect. Yellow brick walls stained with decades of weather damage, cracked concrete walkways that collected stagnant puddles after every rainstorm, landscaping that consisted primarily of overgrown shrubs and patches of dying grass that the overworked maintenance staff rarely bothered to water or trim properly. Harold Mitchell occupied his usual corner table with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades following strict military protocols and operational procedures. At 78 years old, his body had become a comprehensive catalog of physical limitations and daily discomforts, arthritic hands that trembled uncontrollably when he attempted to grip his coffee cup, hearing that fluctuated unpredictably like a poorly tuned radio struggling to maintain signal clarity, vision that blurred whenever he tried to focus on newspaper headlines or television screens for extended periods. Yet despite these accumulating physical failures that marked the inevitable progression of advanced age, his mind remained as sharp and precisely calibrated as the military-issued chronometer he had carried during his years of active service in classified operations, cutting through layers of accumulated memories with surgical accuracy that would have impressed the intelligence analysts who had once depended entirely on his observational skills and tactical judgment. Everything about Harold's physical presence suggested a man who had once commanded considerable authority and respect in environments where such qualities meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure that could have international consequences. Even confined to his wheelchair and dependent on others for basic daily activities, he maintained the unconsciously erect posture that decades of military discipline had burned into his muscle memory like a permanent brand. His shoulders, though now thin and rounded with the inevitable effects of advanced age and physical decline, still carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent years wearing uniforms and accepting responsibility for life and death decisions in hostile foreign territories where American personnel weren't supposed to exist according to any official government records or public documentation. It was exactly 1:47 p.m. on this particular Saturday afternoon. Harold's mind still automatically converted civilian time into the 24-hour military format that had governed his professional existence for more than 2 decades of active service, a habit so deeply ingrained through years of operational conditioning that he couldn't abandon it even during retirement in a civilian nursing facility where such precision seemed not only unnecessary but mildly eccentric to staff members who measured time primarily in medication schedules and meal service rotations rather than operational deadlines and mission-critical timing requirements. In precisely 13 minutes, according to the rigid institutional schedule that governed every aspect of daily life at Sunset Horizons, with bureaucratic efficiency, the other residents would begin their weekly migration from their individual rooms to the common area for what the administrative staff optimistically referred to as social hour. They would settle into their assigned vinyl-covered chairs with their crossword puzzle books and dog-eared romance novels, and someone would inevitably make the request that had become as predictable and ritualistic as the posting of weekly meal menus near the main reception desk, where visitors signed in and out under the watchful eye of security personnel. "Harold, tell us one of your war stories," they would say, their voices carrying that particular tone of patronizing kindness, typically reserved for confused elderly relatives and small children who needed to be humored rather than genuinely engaged with as adults capable of meaningful conversation about complex subjects. The emphasis on the word stories always carried a subtle note of gentle mockery, as if Harold's detailed accounts were charming fairy tales rather than actual memories of classified operations that had influenced the course of international relations during some of the most dangerous and politically volatile periods of the late 20th century. But the secret detail that could silence every doubt had yet to be revealed. Harold would tell his stories anyway, not because he derived any pleasure from being the object of barely concealed mockery and professional concern from medical staff who documented his behavior as symptoms of advancing cognitive decline, but because the accumulated weight of classified memories pressed down on his consciousness every waking moment like a physical burden that demanded acknowledgement and verbal expression. These weren't simply recollections stored in his aging brain for nostalgic contemplation during lonely afternoon hours. They were the preserved fragments of operations that had shaped international relations during some of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, prevented armed conflicts that could have escalated into full-scale nuclear confrontations between superpowers, and quite possibly altered the entire trajectory of late 20th century geopolitics in ways that would never be acknowledged in any public historical record, academic study, or government documentation accessible to civilian researchers. His accounts invariably began with the same military precision and obsessive attention to operational detail that had characterized every classified briefing he had ever delivered to commanding officers, intelligence analysts, and congressional oversight committees during his years of active service conducting covert operations in hostile territory. November 15th, 1987, 3 a.m. local time, Harold would announce, his voice suddenly acquiring the steady, authoritative cadence that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep within his deteriorating physical frame, like an echo from his professional past when he had commanded respect and attention from some of the most powerful people in the American government and intelligence establishment. My team initiated a covert infiltration operation targeting the Soviet nuclear research facility located at precisely 47.3 kilometers northeast of Kabul, Afghanistan, bearing 0.25 degrees magnetic from the abandoned Soviet airbase, at exact grid coordinates 34 degrees, 35 minutes, 42 seconds, north, 69 degrees, 18 minutes, 15 seconds east. The extraordinary specificity of Harold's technical details created an atmosphere of profound discomfort among his listeners that none of them could adequately explain or articulate to the nursing staff members who documented these episodes in their daily reports about residents' behavioral patterns and potential symptoms of progressive cognitive decline requiring medical intervention. Genuine fantasies, the kind typically constructed by elderly minds struggling with various forms of dementia and age-related mental deterioration, were usually characterized by vague generalizations and dramatic elements borrowed from popular entertainment sources like television programs, Hollywood movies, or paperback novels found in hospital waiting rooms. Harold's accounts, however, were methodical, technical, and often tediously precise in ways that made them sound more like official military documentation than the imaginative storytelling of a confused old man seeking attention from anyone willing to listen to his rambling monologues about imaginary adventures in exotic foreign locations that he had never actually visited during his relatively mundane military career. He would spend 20 or 30 minutes describing guard rotation schedules that followed authentic Soviet military protocols from the 1980s, detailing the specific timing and positioning of sentries in ways that demonstrated intimate knowledge of Eastern Bloc security procedures that weren't commonly available in civilian reference materials or declassified government publications accessible to the general public through normal research channels. His descriptions included precise measurements of building dimensions, technical specifications for ventilation systems, electrical infrastructure details, and architectural features that suggested first-hand observation rather than information gathered from books, movies, or other indirect sources that confused elderly veterans sometimes used to construct satisfying alternatives to their actual military experiences. The primary facility structure was constructed using standard Soviet-era reinforced concrete with load-bearing walls measuring exactly 2.4 meters in thickness, Harold would continue, his pale blue eyes focusing intently on something that existed far beyond the institutional beige walls of the nursing home common room, as if he were observing the actual Afghan mountainside and reliving the tactical challenges of the mission rather than sitting among fellow residents who were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction and intensity of his detailed recollections. The complex featured 3 distinct underground levels connected by a single central elevator system and 2 emergency stairwells positioned at opposite corners of the installation, according to standard Warsaw Pact construction specifications for hardened military facilities designed to withstand direct nuclear attack. The other residents would shift uncomfortably in their chairs during these extended technical recitations, exchanging meaningful glances that communicated their shared assessment of Harold's deteriorating mental state and their collective wish that he would choose less disturbing topics for his weekly storytelling sessions that were supposed to provide pleasant social interaction rather than detailed accounts of international espionage and military operations that seemed to grow more elaborate and impossible with each passing week. Mrs. Patterson would return her attention to her knitting project with aggressive efficiency that suggested irritation with the interruption to her peaceful afternoon routine. Mr. Chen would raise his newspaper slightly higher, creating a physical barrier between himself and Harold's increasingly elaborate tales of classified operations and foreign military installations that seemed designed to make him appear more important and interesting than his actual military service had probably been during his younger years before age, and loneliness had motivated him to construct these detailed fantasies about international intrigue and covert operations. The nursing staff members would observe these interactions with the kind of professional detachment that their training had taught them to maintain when dealing with residents who exhibited signs of advancing dementia and other age-related cognitive disorders requiring careful monitoring and documentation for medical and legal purposes. They would make mental notes for their shift reports about Harold's continued confabulation episodes, and the apparent progression of what they had been told was a classic case of elderly veterans constructing elaborate false memories to compensate for lives they perceived as lacking in excitement, significance, or recognition from family members and society in general. Yet the most disturbing revelation was still locked inside his memory. But Harold would continue speaking with unwavering determination, driven by psychological pressures that went far deeper than any need for social attention or validation from his institutional caregivers and fellow residents, who clearly didn't understand or appreciate the magnitude of the experiences he was attempting to share with them. He would describe classified military operations conducted in countries that officially maintained no diplomatic relations with the United States during the specific historical periods he referenced with such meticulous accuracy that it made listeners wonder where he could possibly have acquired such detailed knowledge, if he hadn't actually participated in the events he described. He would provide comprehensive technical specifications for weapons systems that didn't appear in any publicly available reference materials or military equipment catalogs that civilian researchers could access through normal channels. He would recite verbatim conversations with foreign intelligence officers whose identities were protected by classification systems that wouldn't be eligible for review by declassification authorities for several more decades, and whose very existence was denied by government officials whenever journalists or congressional investigators asked direct questions about American intelligence activities in specific foreign countries during particular time periods. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the facility's chief psychiatrist and the ultimate authority on residents' psychological assessments and treatment plans, had developed a comprehensive clinical framework for understanding and treating Harold's particular manifestation of age-related cognitive decline that satisfied both her professional training in geriatric mental health and the administrative requirements of the nursing home's medical documentation systems that were subject to regular inspection by state healthcare authorities. During her regularly scheduled monthly consultations with Harold's niece, Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Walsh would explain the phenomenon with the kind of professional compassion and scientific authority that characterized her approach to all family members struggling to comprehend their elderly relatives' deteriorating mental capabilities and increasingly problematic behavioral patterns that sometimes created difficulties for staff and other residents. What your uncle is experiencing represents a textbook case of confabulation syndrome, Dr. Walsh would explain from behind her desk. In an office decorated with psychology textbooks, medical journals, and diplomas that testified to her expertise in geriatric mental health assessment and treatment methodologies developed through decades of clinical research and practical experience with elderly patients suffering from various forms of cognitive decline. This condition is remarkably common among military veterans, particularly those individuals who feel that their actual service experiences lacked the excitement, significance, or recognition that they believe their sacrifices and dedication to their country deserved during their younger years when they were physically capable of meaningful contribution to national security objectives. Dr. Walsh would lean forward in her leather chair, her expression conveying the perfect balance of clinical objectivity and empathetic understanding that she had cultivated through years of delivering difficult diagnoses to concerned family members who were struggling to accept the reality of their loved ones' progressive mental deterioration and the practical implications for their care requirements and safety considerations. The human brain possesses an extraordinary capacity for constructive memory formation, particularly in elderly patients whose cognitive function is beginning to deteriorate due to various neurological factors associated with the natural aging process and the gradual breakdown of neural pathways responsible for accurate memory storage and retrieval. Sarah Mitchell would listen to these explanations with profound relief, grateful to have a rational, scientifically grounded framework for understanding her uncle's increasingly problematic behavior that had been causing her considerable embarrassment and concern during her monthly visits to Sunset Horizons over the past several years. She had been struggling with Harold's military stories for nearly 6 years, ever since he had been moved to the nursing facility following a minor stroke that had compromised his ability to live independently in the small apartment where he had spent the first decade of his retirement from what she had always understood to be a relatively routine military career involving primarily administrative duties and training. Responsibilities, rather than the exotic overseas assignments and classified operations he now claimed to remember in such disturbing detail. The stories had evolved considerably over time, beginning as relatively straightforward accounts of routine military activities and training exercises, but gradually expanding into complex narratives involving multiple foreign countries, exotic weapons systems, high-level diplomatic negotiations, and covert operations that supposedly influenced major international events during the Cold War era. Sarah found herself dreading her monthly visits, not because she lacked genuine affection for her uncle, who had been one of the few stable adult influences in her life during childhood when her parents' divorce had created household chaos and emotional uncertainty, but because his increasingly fantastic tales created embarrassing situations when other families were present during visiting hours, and she had to endure their stares and whispered conversations about the old man, who was obviously losing his grip on reality in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. He insists that he personally participated in diplomatic negotiations with high-ranking Soviet military leaders during prisoner exchanges that don't appear in any historical documentation I've been able to find through internet searches and library research, Sarah would confide to Dr. Walsh during their private conversations, her voice carrying the emotional strain that characterized family members dealing with a loved one's progressive cognitive decline and the practical challenges of managing their care while maintaining some semblance of normal family relationships. He describes infiltrating chemical weapons manufacturing facilities in Syria, conducting long-term surveillance operations in North Korea, and sabotaging weapons shipments in various Eastern European countries that he probably couldn't locate on a world map if you asked him to do so during his more lucid moments when he's not constructing these elaborate fantasies about international espionage and military heroics. Sarah would pause in her recitation of Harold's increasingly impossible claims, gazing out the window of Dr. Walsh's office at the parking lot, where her car waited to transport her back to her normal civilian life, away from the institutional atmosphere and the uncomfortable reality of her uncle's mental deterioration that seemed to be accelerating with each passing month, according to the nursing staff's observations and medical assessments. What concerns me most is his absolute conviction that these stories represent genuine memories rather than constructed fantasies designed to make himself seem more important and interesting than his actual military service probably was during his younger years. He doesn't appear to be trying to entertain people or attract attention to himself in the way that some elderly residents do when they feel neglected or forgotten by family members who don't visit frequently enough or spend adequate time listening to their reminiscences about past experiences and accomplishments. What neither Dr. Walsh nor Sarah could possibly have comprehended was that Harold's stories weren't fantasies, delusions, or symptoms of advancing cognitive decline requiring medical intervention and behavioral management strategies. Every seemingly impossible detail, every incredible claim, every apparently delusional account was based on actual classified military operations that had been meticulously documented in government files sealed away in secure storage facilities that most federal employees would never see or even know existed within the vast bureaucratic structure of the national security apparatus that protected America's most sensitive intelligence operations and covert activities from unauthorized disclosure. Harold Mitchell had indeed served behind enemy lines in places that didn't officially exist, according to any public records or acknowledgments by government officials who were required to maintain plausible deniability regarding American military activities in countries where such operations could have created serious diplomatic complications or international incidents if their existence had been revealed to foreign governments or media organizations. For 23 years, he had worked in the most secretive division of military intelligence ever created by the United States government during the height of the Cold War paranoia that gripped Washington throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when the threat of nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union dominated strategic planning and resource allocation decisions at the highest levels of government. His unit, officially designated Blackbird Squadron, In internal documentation, but never acknowledged in any public military records, organizational charts, or budget allocations that could be accessed through normal congressional oversight processes or Freedom of Information Act requests submitted by journalists and researchers interested in government intelligence activities, existed in the deepest shadows of government operations where accountability and transparency were considered less important than operational effectiveness, and the protection of sources and methods that enabled American intelligence agencies to gather crucial information about foreign military capabilities and hostile intentions. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Mitchell's genuine military service record was buried so deep within classified archive systems that even Pentagon officials with top-secret security clearances and extensive need-to-know authorizations would require special permission and compelling operational justification to access the relevant files through the compartmentalized information systems that protected the most sensitive government secrets from unauthorized disclosure to personnel who lacked specific authorization to receive particular categories of classified information. The squadron had been established in 1974 as a joint initiative between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense, specifically designed to handle intelligence operations that were too politically sensitive for regular military units, but required the tactical expertise, operational security, and specialized training that could only be provided by the most elite special operations personnel available within the American military establishment. These were missions that existed in the gray areas between conventional military operations and civilian intelligence gathering, requiring personnel who could operate effectively in hostile environments while maintaining complete deniability regarding their true identities, objectives, and government affiliations. Between January 1975 and December 1998, Harold had been deployed to 53 different locations across 4 continents, often for extended periods lasting several months at a time while he conducted surveillance operations, gathered intelligence on foreign weapons programs, established contact with foreign assets, and occasionally engaged in direct action missions that were designed to prevent international conflicts from escalating beyond the control of diplomatic solutions and peaceful negotiation processes. His assignments had taken him to Soviet nuclear weapons facilities hidden deep within the remote mountain ranges of Afghanistan, where American intelligence teams conducted surveillance operations that provided crucial early warning intelligence about weapons development programs that could have fundamentally altered the strategic balance between superpowers during the final years of the Cold War confrontation that threatened global stability and peace. He had participated in covert infiltration operations targeting biological weapons research laboratories concealed within the dense jungle regions of Myanmar and Laos, facilities where scientists working for hostile governments were developing pathogenic agents that could have devastated civilian populations throughout Southeast Asia if they had ever been successfully weaponized and deployed against Western targets through terrorist proxy organizations that were already active in the region during the 1980s and 90s. These operations required months of preparation, detailed intelligence gathering, careful coordination with local assets who risked their lives to provide information and logistical support, and precise execution under extremely dangerous conditions where discovery could have resulted in capture, torture, and execution by hostile security forces. Harold had conducted extended surveillance and occasional sabotage operations at underground command and control bunkers located throughout Eastern European countries, installations so highly classified that their existence was denied by both NATO and Warsaw Pact governments, even when confronted with photographic evidence and detailed intelligence reports documenting their construction, operational purposes, and strategic significance within the broader context of Cold War military planning and nuclear deterrence strategies that governed international relations during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Each mission had been compartmentalized according to strict intelligence protocols that had been developed and refined during the early decades of the Cold War to prevent unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information and protect active operations from compromise by enemy intelligence services who were constantly attempting to penetrate American security systems and identify personnel involved in classified activities that could be exploited for propaganda purposes or strategic advantage. Harold possessed detailed knowledge only of his specific operational role within each larger strategic objective. And when missions concluded successfully, all documentation was immediately transferred to classified storage vaults located in secure government facilities that wouldn't be eligible for declassification review for a minimum of 50 years under federal regulations governing the protection of national security information and intelligence. Sources and methods. He had signed multiple legal documents that bound him to absolute silence regarding his military service until his death. Agreements that carried the full weight of federal espionage statutes and included explicit threats of life imprisonment in maximum security federal facilities if those secrecy oaths were ever violated through unauthorized disclosure to civilian personnel lacking appropriate security clearances and operational need-to-know authorization from competent government authorities. But as Harold entered his final years, and the early stages of dementia began affecting his judgment, impulse control mechanisms, and ability to maintain the psychological barriers that had protected classified information throughout his retirement from active service. Those carefully guarded state secrets started gradually emerging from his subconscious memory, like water slowly seeping through microscopic cracks in a concrete dam that had been built to contain tremendous pressure for decades without showing any signs of structural weakness or vulnerability to external forces. The classified recollections surfaced disguised as seemingly harmless rambling stories that everyone immediately dismissed as the confused fantasies of an elderly man whose cognitive abilities were obviously deteriorating according to the clinical assessments provided by medical professionals who had no knowledge of Harold's actual military background or the genuine experiences that formed the foundation of his supposedly delusional narratives about international espionage and covert operations conducted in hostile territory under extremely dangerous conditions. Sarah Mitchell's monthly visits to Sunset Horizons had evolved into exercises in patience and barely controlled embarrassment over the course of several years, as Harold's stories became increasingly detailed and seemingly impossible to believe without accepting the premise that her uncle had been involved in the kind of classified military operations that were typically portrayed in Hollywood movies, rather than real-life experiences of ordinary veterans who had served their country honorably but without particular distinction or recognition for extraordinary service above and beyond the call of duty. During one especially difficult afternoon visit in late September, Harold had launched into an exhaustively detailed account of infiltrating a Syrian government chemical weapons production facility located in an industrial complex outside the city of Aleppo, during what he claimed was a joint operation conducted with British Special Air Service forces in 1994. His description included specific grid coordinates that he recited from memory with mathematical precision that seemed impossible for someone whose cognitive function was supposedly deteriorating due to advancing age and neurological damage. Detailed architectural floor plans that he sketched on paper napkins with remarkable accuracy, considering his arthritis and trembling hands. Comprehensive inventories of laboratory equipment that he identified by manufacturer names and model numbers that demonstrated sophisticated technical knowledge, guard rotation schedules that he explained with reference to standard Syrian military protocols that weren't commonly available in civilian reference sources, security procedures that demonstrated intimate understanding of Middle Eastern operational environments, and even the precise chemical signatures of nerve agents that were supposedly being manufactured at the facility for eventual distribution to international terrorist organizations operating throughout Europe and the Mediterranean region. "Uncle Harold, please," Sarah had whispered with urgent concern, glancing nervously at the other families, who were clearly listening to every word of his detailed recitation about chemical weapons production methods and international arms trafficking networks that seemed too specific and technical to be the product of an elderly man's imagination. "People are staring at us, and these stories are getting completely out of control. Dr. Walsh has explained that you're experiencing confabulation episodes, and I think she's absolutely right about your condition. You need to stop discussing these things that never actually happened and focus on real memories from your actual military service instead of these elaborate fantasies." Harold had turned to regard his niece with those pale blue eyes that possessed the remarkable ability to transform instantly from cloudy and unfocused to absolutely laser-sharp and penetrating, as if some internal switch had been activated that restored his mental clarity for brief moments, despite the progressive neurological deterioration that was supposedly affecting his cognitive function and ability to distinguish between reality and imagination. Something in his expression conveyed a depth of authentic experience and hard-earned authority that seemed completely incompatible with the frail, elderly man confined to a wheelchair in front of her, suggesting reserves of knowledge and competence that couldn't be easily dismissed as the products of age-related mental decline or deliberate fabrication designed to attract attention and sympathy from family members and caregivers. "Let them stare all they want, Sarah," he had replied, with quiet intensity, his voice carrying an edge of steel that she had never heard before, and that seemed to emerge from some deep reservoir of professional competence and personal conviction that had somehow survived the ravages of age, illness, and the psychological isolation that characterized his existence at Sunset Horizons. "Every single person in this building sleeps safely and peacefully in their comfortable beds every night because of operations that took place in locations they'll never know about, conducted by people whose names they'll never learn, paid for with sacrifices they could never comprehend, understand, or appreciate. Even if someone tried to explain the full magnitude of what was at stake during those years when the world came closer to nuclear war than most civilians ever realized." The breaking point had come during the family's Christmas dinner celebration in 2019, when Harold was describing a Cambodia mission and Sarah's teenage son, Michael, started laughing openly at what he perceived as obviously fabricated military adventures borrowed from video games and action movies. "Come on, Grandpa Harold. That stuff sounds exactly like Call of Duty. None of that crazy stuff actually happened." Harold had stared at his great-nephew for what seemed like an eternity before quietly leaving the table and never discussing his military service again with any member of his family, who had made it clear they considered his most important memories to be the delusional fantasies of a confused old man whose grip on reality was slipping away. From that devastating Christmas Day forward, Harold Mitchell had retreated into complete psychological isolation, abandoning his attempts to share the classified memories that had been the foundation of his identity and sense of purpose for more than 2 decades. And just when his silence seemed permanent, fate delivered its proof. 3 months later, he died peacefully in his sleep, taking with him secrets that had shaped international relations during some of the most dangerous periods in modern history. His final years marked by the crushing loneliness of carrying truths that no one would believe or validate. His funeral was modest until 4 elderly men in expensive suits appeared, claiming to be Harold's former military associates. One placed an American flag on his casket and whispered inaudibly before pressing a military challenge coin into Sarah's hand. "Your uncle was a good man who served with extraordinary distinction. Cleaning out Harold's room afterward, Sarah discovered a hidden military footlocker containing items that belonged to a stranger. Foreign medals, classified maps, photographs from exotic locations, and a 7-page letter explaining his real military career in the most secretive intelligence division ever created. Harold's letter provided coordinates and operation names that Sarah researched, eventually connecting with investigative journalist David Chen, who had spent years documenting classified Cold War operations. Enhanced satellite imagery from 2020 revealed the exact underground facility Harold had described in Afghanistan, validating every impossible detail he had shared during those Saturday afternoon sessions that everyone had dismissed as dementia-induced fantasies. The moment the world learned the truth, history shifted. Chen's book, The Ghosts of Blackbird Squadron, sparked national attention and congressional hearings about classified service veterans. Sarah appeared on television reading Harold's letter, describing how her uncle had died, thinking his family believed he was delusional when he was actually sharing genuine memories of service that had literally shaped world history. The story resonated nationwide as hundreds of similar families contacted Sarah with their own experiences of elderly relatives whose detailed military accounts had been dismissed as cognitive decline. The Pentagon eventually acknowledged that certain personnel had served in classified capacities that couldn't be disclosed, leading to new legislation providing better care and recognition for veterans whose heroic service remained buried in classified files. At Arlington National Cemetery, Harold finally received the recognition he deserved when his unit was partially declassified and he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. Sarah stood as a general, placed the medal on Harold's headstone, finally understanding that her uncle had been exactly what he claimed, a soldier who had been places that didn't officially exist, preventing conflicts that would have cost thousands of lives, carrying the burden of silence because his nation's security depended on it. Harold Mitchell was not a liar. He was a patriot who died believing the people he loved most thought he was delusional. But his legacy lives on in families who now understand that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the only true ones.